guys, we're in the middle of week 34. Lots more Ezekiel. How you doing? Are you enjoying it? It's a little difficult. It's pretty weird, right? We're going to go into some things today. Just I hope it's useful. Ezekiel 18, there's this part where it talks about how the people are saying that the fathers have eaten sour grapes and the children's teeth are set on edge. And then there is this long discussion about how, well, basically the soul that sins will die. And so each soul will pay for the things that it has done, not for the things that its fathers have done. And so you have the picture of a man, his son, and then his grandson. So you have a wicked man, a righteous man, and another wicked man, and the things that happen to them because of their own personal choices. So as I was reading this, I thought, does this contradict Exodus 20 verse 5 or Exodus 34 6 through 7, where God talks about how he brings the iniquity of the fathers onto the children onto the third and fourth generation of those who hate him, but he preserves his love toward 1,000 of generations of those who love him. And so what's the difference here? Where's God saying, okay, I'm going to bring the consequences of iniquity onto the children for 3 and 4 generations for those who hate me, and here the soul that sins shall die. The person will die for his own sin. Okay, so one of the things that's happening here, just for context, is that the people are hiding behind a proverb. We have to look at where they are. They're in exile, and they're trying to probably justify to themselves why they're there. And so they're hiding behind this proverb, basically saying, our fathers ate the sour grapes, and our teeth are set on edge. Everything that's going on here is because of the bad things that our fathers have done. But they're not taking into account how they contribute to the bad things that their fathers have done. So essentially, they're excusing themselves from ever having to change. It's very convenient to be able to blame the previous generation. So that's what's going on. They're avoiding dealing with their own sin. And so this is, we see this in their own generation, all of the things that are happening inside of the temple, all of the different idols that generation is still worshiping, despite everything God has done. You see these own peoples, their own hard-heartedness with the way that they treat Ezekiel, the way that they talk to him, the way that they treat his prophecy. Like, he is basically for them the best show in town because he does such bizarre things, but they don't take his message seriously. And so they're still hard-hearted. And so they're using this proverb. They were using it with Jeremiah as well. It says it in Jeremiah 31, 29 through 30. They were avoiding their part in the responsibility of the exile. And so in Ezekiel 18 and in Jeremiah 31, God basically says, you're not allowed to use that proverb anymore. Like, you don't get to hide behind that idea anymore. He does away with the proverb, and he says that the soul that sins shall die. Every person is responsible for his or her response to God. And so you have collective payment for what people have done in the past. You have this, like each individual in Israel or Judah didn't choose to go into exile, or each individual didn't like specifically bring on the exile of all of the people. They brought that on themselves together for centuries and for generations. They just never stopped doing it. So generations do live out the natural and logical consequence of their parents' choices. I think any of us that are, children or grandchildren of alcoholics can say we live out the consequence of the choices of previous generations. There's stuff that happens within our family narrative that marks us for generations because of the terrible choices of one person. And so that's a natural and logical consequence of just how a sin affects this world. So you live that out either for blessing or cursing. And so you have someone who's had a family that has loved and adored the Lord. Even if you personally don't, you're going to live out some of the good consequences of the choices they've made because of the stability you lived in, the provision that you had, even if you didn't believe in the Lord. And so there is that. But we also see that each individual gets to choose within his or her own life whether he or she will respond to God's word in faith and live or die to him. Righteousness or unrighteousness is an individual standing before God as well as a communal standing. And so the person that stands rightly before the Lord is the person that's chosen God's way, that walks with the Lord, that believes in the blood of Jesus Christ and in Jesus Christ as Lord. Like, that's an individual step that you take. No one can take it for you. And also, to reject the gospel is an individual step that you take that no one can reject for you. And so that's outside of the generational consequences that happen because someone loved or hated the Lord in another time. So Ezekiel, he gives these three very specific, very concrete examples of individuals, their choices, and the consequences of those choices. So he's actually not contradicting the rest of the Bible. And that's, I think, where we get tripped up sometimes, is because there are a lot of people who will say, oh, the Bible contradicts itself, and they'll pull something like this out and they'll compare two verses and say, look, they say opposite things. But that's where, again, like, we have to look at the context. We have to understand and know the context. And again, like, we have to be faithful to want to know the Lord of the Bible and base our interpretations as well on what we know of his character, and his truthfulness. Because again, that, the Bible contradicts itself, or God's lying to you, God's holding something back. Those are Satan's words. And we don't have to believe them or accept them, and we do have answers for them. So I hope that's helpful. Ezekiel 21:18-23. The king of Babylon stands at the crossroads reading a liver. What's going on? This seems so strange to us. He's got a harusplex. That's what that's called, is a person that reads organs. A harusplex. That's a good Roman word, because it was so common that they had their own word for it. And then we could call it hepatoscopy, or the reading of livers. And so this was a real thing. It's actually still a real thing in some places. Many ancient peoples practiced this, but the Babylonians took it to a new level. They had books on hepatoscopy. I love saying it. And so they actually would make anatomically correct clay models of livers that had, like, different veins in different places, or places where, like, one little organ had not detached completely from the liver when they ripped it out. They made clay models of all of this kind of stuff as instructional material for their professional sorcerers. I mean, these guys actually studied. They went to, like, sorcerer college. They went to Hogwarts. And so they studied these things. And so each like change in the liver, each little vein had its own significance. And you actually studied for years to be able to say, okay, I see that place there, and I see, like, there's a tumor over there, and that's what that means. And so they would take an animal, they'd cut it up, look at the liver. The liver and the other organs would tell them what the weather would be like, or whether one decision or another was favorable. And so it was kind of seen as this, it's the natural sympathetic fallacy. It's where there's perceived to be a connection between, like, the natural and supernatural world, such that everything is reflected in the stars, and so we can tell what our lives are going to be like from the stars. Or here it's sort of going inward instead of outward, that everything is reflected in the liver of an animal. Like, the gods have prepared a message in the liver, and this is going to tell us what to do. So that's what's going on there. If you've ever read Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, you've actually run into this before. And here Ezekiel is giving God's perspective on what's going on. He says the king of Babylon may be reading a liver, but he's still stuck in God's plan. So he can read all the livers he likes and it won't make any difference. So anyway, God knows where he is, sees him at the crossroads, and also knows which way he's going to go. So that pagan way of doing things just really doesn't work. Ezekiel 24:15-27. This is a really hard passage. God tells Ezekiel, I'm going to take your wife away. I'm going to take away the delight of your eyes, and you're not allowed to mourn. This is just, it's really hard. So what does this mean? Why is this happening? So I found a couple of different perspectives. First, on what the mourning could be about. So it could be mourning after death, as in you're not allowed to be sad and cry out and all this stuff after she dies. Or it could be a mourning before death, a petitionary mourning, as I saw in one of the articles I read. And so it's intended to ask God not to take her life. Most scholars think that, like, Ezekiel hears about the death of his wife in the morning, and she dies in the evening, and then he talks to the people again the next morning. And so that he had a day's notice, and God says, you're not allowed to petition or intercede or tear your hair out or wear sackcloth or any of those signs of mourning. So that's maybe one thing that the mourning might be. This article was a lady named Diana Lipton. It's called Early Mourning, Petitionary versus Posthumous Ritual in Ezekiel 24. That'll bless you. So the response that God's actually demanding of Israel with this could be that they're not to mourn once Jerusalem has fallen, because this is the natural and logical consequence of their choices that they've made. They've brought this on themselves. They should have been weeping earlier. Or it could be that they're not to cry and weep and ask God about it because it's too late, which goes with Jeremiah when God says, don't pray for this people anymore. So we don't really know. Either way, it's a difficult story. And so one possible answer from this is that maybe Ezekiel's wife is already sick. It seems to indicate from the language there that she dies of a plague. The word that is translated in the New King James with one stroke is commonly translated as a plague. So it's like the stroke of a plague, an illness that comes on quickly. And so it may be that God's not just like killing this woman just to make a point, but this woman's sick and she's going to die. And to me, that does make a difference. And so that it's not just God using her life as an object lesson and not caring about Ezekiel and this woman, but she was going to die of a plague. But he does use such a terrible moment to illustrate how tragic the fall of Jerusalem is, both for the people and from his own perspective. Because Jerusalem, Israel, has been the delight of his eyes too. That in Hosea, she's pictured as his wife, his adulterous wife. And so that in some ways, this bringing about this terrible doom on Jerusalem and the temple and all of this stuff, like God was there when the temple was built. God was there when Solomon's heart was faithful. And then he was there when Solomon's heart fell. And he was there every time someone came genuinely petitioning him. That this is the delight of his eyes, and it hurts him just as much to have to bring about this terrible doom on his own people. It was never what he would have wanted. That's why he always told them, don't do it. And so there's that pain for him. There's that pain for Israel as well. At the temple, this was like the delight of their eyes. So why am I bringing this up? Years ago, I went to a youth conference, and one of the preachers talked about Ezekiel 24 to a group of teenagers. And his basic thing was, you serve God, maybe God will kill your wife, but you should still serve God. And so there were all these teenagers, and they were terrified, and it just was a terrible thing to do to a group of people who were young and vulnerable. And so I think when you look at this, like, this is not saying, serve the Lord, he's arbitrary. You know, if you love anything enough, he will take it away. Because I think that's a picture that we get often of God. Like, if you love something too much, he'll take it away. I think this is a one-off. This is something that happens one time to one person. And it illustrates one big, terrible, horrible moment. And I don't think that this is something that God asks of everyone who follows him. Now, following him does mean death to yourself, but it doesn't mean he's going to kill your spouse. So, and I think most of us can attest to that. Like, it hasn't happened to most people, right? So anyway, I hope that's useful. Don't tell teenagers that. Jeremiah 34:18. God says, I will give the men who have transgressed my covenant, who have not fulfilled the words of the covenant which they made before me, when they cut the calf in two and passed between its parts. I want to bring this out just as an observation. This is how they made a covenant. So when we read Genesis 15 and we look, and Abraham is cutting the calves and all these animals in two, and then God's passing between the parts and not Abraham, this is very much an illustration of what's going on. The lesser member passes between the parts, and God passed between the parts in Genesis 15. It just speaks of where he was putting himself, and the way he was putting himself on the line for Abraham, knowing that he would be the one to be figuratively like the calf cut in half and have people walk in his blood. And so there's a Feinberg commentator. He says, as in the Assyrian inscriptions, the intention was that as they passed through the pieces of the divided sacrifice, they invoked on themselves a curse that if they broke the covenant, they would be cut in pieces like the sacrificial calf. So this is what gives us some really good biblical context for what's going on in Genesis 15 as well. And it's how we understand it as well as we do. So I hope that's helpful. Last, I have two more things. One, Ezekiel 26:6 and following. There's this doom on Tyre, and God talks about Nebuchadnezzar. And then what happens in history is that Nebuchadnezzar comes and he doesn't destroy all of Tyre, and then God gives him another nation as payment. And then much, much later, Alexander comes and destroys all of Tyre. So what's going on there? One, God says he's going to send nations against Tyre. He doesn't just say Nebuchadnezzar and Nebuchadnezzar is going to destroy it completely. So this is not a contradiction between history and the Bible. God's going to send nations against Tyre. One of the nations that he sends, among many, is Nebuchadnezzar. And if you actually look on a map, Tyre was what would that be? It was like two cities that were one. It's Minneapolis, St. Paul. But no, so you have a city on the coast, which is Tyre itself, and then you have an island, which is just off the coast, which is also Tyre, and it's a heavily fortified area. Nebuchadnezzar comes against the coastal Tyre, and he actually destroys coastal Tyre. So that's the first part of the destruction of Tyre, completely fulfilled under Nebuchadnezzar. And it's like in such ruins that even later on, several hundred years later, when Alexander comes in the 330s, he's able to take those blocks of all of the buildings that have already sort of been dismantled, and he takes all of those blocks and he uses those blocks to build a bridge, a crossway out to island Tyre, so that he can destroy island Tyre and then leave both areas as places that are so bare that people can hang their nets out for drying. And so it actually does get fulfilled. The Bible's not contradicting itself. Ezekiel 28, just want to bring this out very quickly because you have two rulers in Tyre when you read Ezekiel 28. So people have said, oh, is this really about the devil? What's going on here? Because you have this human ruler, and so this is really all about the human ruler. Probably not, because the first part of the chapter talks to the prince of Tyre. That's one word, prince. And so the prince of Tyre, and it describes him and his doom, and he is a human person. And then the second part of the chapter talks about the king of Tyre. So prince and king, they're two very different words, two very different concepts. You know, one is in charge and the other is in charge of that guy. And so the king of Tyre he's described as having pipes and timbrels, and he's made of instruments. He's a covering cherub on the mountain of God. This is not a man. This is a supernatural being. And so when you read those two things carefully, look at the difference between the prince of Tyre and the king of Tyre. And so that's how we arrive at the conclusion that it's talking about the devil and the king of Tyre. So I hope that's helpful, useful for you. Have a great week.